Someone once told me that those things that we measure, we then have the ability to improve upon because we're measuring. And in the case of DNS, we have lots and lots of statistics that are available. Most of them are available to us via PowerShell. And I want to share with you some cool ways that we can use PowerShell to extract that information. I also wanted to talk with you about what groups in an Active Directory environment are automatically going to have the rights to administer and work with your DNS servers. And if you want to go change that, how you go tweak that. And third, I want to have a chat with you regarding server types. In fact, we can do that discussion right now. One of our options as we deploy the role of the DNS server is we could deploy that on a Windows 2016 Nano server, which is a new Windows Server 2016 deployment option, and it's similar to Windows Server Core. However, it has a lot less hardware requirements. It has very limited local sign-in capabilities and local administration, and the Nano server supports only 64-bit apps. So two really good use cases for Nano server would be the web services with IIS and also DNS. With one caveat, and I'll point that out right now. We cannot do Active Directory integration with DNS on the Nano server. So if that's something that you're after, so you can do dynamic secure updates, that would be a reason not to use the Nano server for the DNS. And as a result of it not being integrated with Active Directory, it would be keeping the zone files in literal files on the file system instead of keeping it in Active Directory. So if we were to deploy the Nano server and we wanted the DNS role, we basically have two options. One, we could roll out the Nano server and then add the DNS role to it, or we could add the DNS role as part of the rollout of the Nano server. So if we roll out the Nano server first, we can either go to another server with Server Manager and then remotely connect to it to add the role, or we could connect to it remotely with PowerShell. But just remember, because the Nano server has a very small footprint, there's no local administration of the DNS. We do it remotely, for example, from our Windows 10 client, connecting over to the Nano server to implement the role. So next, let's go to our hands-on lab environment, and I'd like to walk you through taking a look at the groups for administering the DNS and also some PowerShell commands for getting statistics out of DNS. So we're going to start off on our Windows 10 client machine, and from here, let's go ahead and use the icon for the PowerShell scripting environment right here on the taskbar. And I've taken the liberty of doing a Control-Shift-R and connecting over to the DCNUG server. So what I'd like to do is chat with you about what these commands do and then give you time in the labs to practice these hands-on. So line number one is simply a clear command to clear statistics system-wide on that DNS server, DC-NUG. And the -force option simply says, don't bother asking me if I'm sure or not, just go ahead and do it. If we wanted to clear the statistics just for a certain zone, we could tack on the -zone name and the zone we want to clear the stats for, and that would clear the stats just for that zone. And that can be very, very helpful because we might want to clear the counters so we can see the new hits and the new counters over, for example, a 5-minute period compared to how many times it's happened over the past 2 weeks. And then row 3, we have get DNS server statistics. Now that one is going to output a huge amount of data. So if we wanted to narrow that down, for example, to a specific zone, we could use row 4 by adding the -zone name and the zone name we want the stats for. I also wanted to talk with you about how we could use a variable to sort out some of that data. For example, in row number 5, we are creating a variable called $stats_all. And that's equaling get-DNS server statistics. So the moment we define that variable, all that data effectively is assigned to that variable. And then in row 6, line 6, we can do a same name dot and then simply a section of that output that will then be displayed to the screen. So if there's like 20 sections and we just want to look at one of them, this is one way of just limiting the output to that section. And the same concept works with assigning a variable to the information in the stats for a zone. And that's row 7, where we're setting up a variable for stats_zone_nug, which is get-DNS server statistics. However, we're limiting it to the statistics for nuggetlab.com. And then I've got 2 examples. It's just taking 2 of those sections out of the get DNS server statistics that will be displayed to the screen when we launch rows 8 and 9. So it's sort of like a 1-2 punch. Number 1, we need to be aware that these commands exist and options for getting the data out. And 2, you deserve to practice it hands-on in the labs we provide so you can get that hands-on practice and experience using these commands. So I'll highlight row number 1 and press F8 to launch that. That'll clear statistics system-wide, and then I'll do the same thing for the zone. And then any counters that come up will be since the clearing of those counters. So row number 3, to get DNS server statistics system-wide, we'll press F8 to launch that. And there's just tons and tons of output here. We have cache statistics, and error statistics, and NetBIOS statistics, and packet statistics. And we could tone that down a bit by asking for just stats for a specific zone. And that's with row number 4, get DNS server statistics for the zone nuggetlab.com. So we'll launch that with an F8 as well. So in the labs, you can scroll through this output, see the information that's there, and then as we start playing with variables, which is row 5, if we execute row 5, it assigns the variable of $stats_all. Effectively, it took the output as it was at this moment, and it assigned it to that variable. And now we can just do a query of that variable, for example, looking for packet statistics or other sections of that output, and it'll just display that output. For example, if we highlight row number 6 and then press F8, and we scroll up just a little bit so we can see the command as well, it's giving us the packet statistics section of the get DNS server statistics based on how we set up that variable. So these numbers right here represent the statistics in real time since we cleared the counters just a moment ago. And the same concept holds true for this variable in row 7, as well as these subsections that will be coming back in rows 8 and 9. So I'd encourage you to type out these commands and practice with them in getting the statistics from the DNS server. The other thing that I would encourage you to do in your practice is that as you're looking at and working with the various statistics, I would also encourage you to go and work with the DNS server and maybe create some records. In fact, let's launch DNS Manager right here, and let's go and expand the dc-nug and expand the forward lookup zones, and let's select nuggetlab.com. And what you could do here is you could right click on nuggetlab.com and create some new records if the records aren't in the dropdown. For example, if we right click and we want to create, for example, an SRV record, which isn't here, we simply go to other new records, and from this dialog box we do have the SRV. This is sorted alphabetically, by the way. All right, the last piece I want to talk to you about is the groups that are built in that have the ability to manage DNS. So if we bring up Server Manager here from the Client NUG machine, and we select on the left all servers, and then selecting DC NUG, if we right click, and from the drop-down select Active Directory Users and Computers, and then expand the nuggetlab.com and go down to Users. By default, the following groups have the authority and the permissions to manage DNS. One is the domain admins, another one is the enterprise admins, and the third one is the DNS admins. And if we go to Administrator, just by double-clicking on Administrator and then clicking on the Members Of tab, he's a member of domain admins, and he's a member of enterprise admins. So if you had additional users that you wanted to give permissions to manage DNS, you could put them in the DNS admins group to give them those rights. Or if you wanted to add new groups with those rights, or you wanted to modify the default rights, we could do that as well. Let's go ahead and close this dialog box for the administrator properties. And let's go back to DNS Manager to take a look at how we could change those rights. All we would do is we could go either server-wide or zone-wide. At the server level, we'll select DC-nug, right-click, and from the drop-down, we'll go down to Properties. On the Properties tab, we'll select Security, and on the Security tab, it specifies that the DNS admins have been given rights to the server, the domain admins have, and because we have DNSSEC, we also have some key admin groups that are also given permissions here. We could use the Add or Remove buttons to remove groups from having rights here. If we wanted to modify them, we could select them. For example, the DNS admins, if we wanted to give full control, we can simply modify that by putting a check in the full control box as an example only, and then clicking Apply. And again, we'd only want to do that if that's our intended result, to give the DNS admins group full control. Or if we want to do it on a zone level, we could close this and go to the properties of a zone. If we click on nuggetlab.com, right click, and then from the drop-down select Properties, we also have a Security tab there as well. And once again, we have the DNS admins, domain admins, and enterprise admins. And as you probably already know, the only sane way to manage an environment with lots of users is to use group membership, where the groups have the permissions and the rights, and then you add the users based on their roles to those groups, at which point they inherit the rights that the group has. And then when that person moves to a different department or has a different role or leaves the company, their user account can be taken out of that role and or disabled, depending on the case, because we want to avoid a situation where we have individual users with manually assigned rights and permissions scattered everywhere, because that leads to permission creep and insecure environments and a very high cost of administrating all of that due to the manual labor. In this nugget, we discussed how we can gather statistics via PowerShell, including how to use variables, and how we could use the Nano server as a DNS server, even though it's a headless device, and we have to use remote management tools to do it. The DNS role is one that it supports. And we also talked about the 3 default admin groups to which we can add users to if we want to give those users administrative privileges regarding our DNS servers. And I invite you to spend some time in the hands-on lab doing what we did together in this nugget to reinforce your skills. So have some fun with the lab, and I'll see you, my friend, in our very next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.